Hi, everyone. This week we're going to talk about race and ethnicity. And if you have noticed, I use a lot of different videos in my different lectures. So videos like TED Talks and TED Ed pieces, and then different news pieces and stuff like that. And I do that because it's important for you to have my perspective as your instructor, but it's also important that you see that there are a diverse range of people who have perspectives on and information on the subjects that we go over in our class. And I'm going to rely especially on that today since we're talking about race and ethnicity, because while I might be a person who has spent a lot of time studying race and ethnicity and I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, it's different for me as a person who can intellectually understand, but maybe not maybe not understand as a person who's actually experienced race and racism. So I'm going to rely pretty heavily on different TED Talks and some different pieces that I've put on Canvas that have to do with race, colorism, ethnicity, the myth of the model minority, which we're going to go over. Yeah, so make sure that as I talk about those through the lecture, you pause and go and watch them. And if you're interested in race and you want to learn or read something interesting about race, first, we're talking about apartheid today. And this is a book by Trevor Noah, Born a Crime. It's about growing up in apartheid-controlled South Africa. And then You Can't Touch My Hair by Phoebe Robinson, which is a humorous look at race and racism in today's US. And then So You Want to Talk About Race goes over a lot of different subjects that have to do with race and racism, again, mostly in the US. Okay, so let's take a look at our lecture. There we go. All right, our first thing, I have a quote from James Baldwin. He's a writer, an American writer, and you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was books that taught me that the things that tormented me the most were the very things that connected me with all the people who were alive and who have ever been alive. There you go. So we're talking race. And then we're going to talk ethnicity, and we're talking about them separately because they're two separate things. And we have race and racism, and in a way those are two very separate things as well, because race is this made up concept, and I'm going to go into how it was made up and where it was made up, but racism is a real thing. And sometimes I'll have people argue with me and say, well, if race is made up, then racism must be fake as well, except that you can have real de facto and de jure institutions. So de facto and de jure meaning by practice and by law. You can have real institutionalized racism. You can have real both de facto and de jure consequences of this made up concept of race, but that doesn't mean that the consequences of that made up concept are not real. So when we talk about racism, it's separate really from the concept of race, since this concept of race was something that was made up, and then racism are very real results of this made up concept. So let's first understand race and where it comes to be, and understand the great chain of being and the geographies of slavery. I have in a map right here. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute. And I've had this TED Ed video in your helpful videos, and I've moved it to your required videos for this section. It's just like a 5-minute video on the Atlantic slave trade. So let me just talk about a couple of concepts in race and then go and watch that 5-minute video. Okay, so I say that race is made up, and that's not me just being some idealistic hippie. It's made up, you can see where it was made up. So this idea that we are physiologically different, that we are different genetically, that we're different based on DNA, that we're different based on phenology, physical characteristics. That term race has been used for a very long time, but it hasn't always been used in terms of color of our skin. So if we look at how race used to be used, race was used to distinguish people who spoke different languages for a while, for a period. And we're talking about Europe, North Africa, Southwest Asia, China. where that term race would have been used to distinguish people by different languages. Then race was used to distinguish people who were different nationalities, meaning they were from different cultural country backgrounds. Race was also used as a way to distinguish people based on religion. So the way that race has been used traditionally has been to distinguish people as different, whether it's that we speak different languages, whether it's that we are parts of different religions, that we're different nationalities. It's always been a way to distinguish us versus them, right? It's always been a way to distinguish people based on different concepts. When we start using race as a term to distinguish people based on color of their skin, eye color, hair, all the things that we now kind of traditionally associate with race, we start using that term to denote skin color in the 1600s in the Caribbean. So in the 1600s in the Caribbean, that's where we have the first written accounts of race being something that has to do with skin color. And you can probably figure out why we would have started using that term to create a separation in people based on skin color. It was because we the world, not we in this class. But remember when we talked about regional economic growth, and remember how I talked about how the Caribbean was this game changer when it came to so many different things in the last 400, 500 years. So if you remember back to the beginning of class, we talked about how here you are in Europe in the mid-latitudes. And in the mid-latitudes, you can grow certain plants like wheat and rice and corn, which are great staples, but you can't grow other things like tea or coffee or sugar. So Europeans traded their limited resources, because remember, Europe has great soil, great water, good coal. It's basically a bunch of peninsulas, so it has good access to trade, but it doesn't have a whole lot of other resources to trade. So they were always at a trade deficit when we're looking at the Silk Road, when they were trading between East Asia, Southwest Asia, and Africa. So they were always trying to get things that they couldn't grow in their part of the world, things like sugar. And then if you remember, and this is in that 5-minute video as well, you have Portuguese who come down here and take over an island that wasn't inhabited, Sao Tome, who start to make a whole bunch of money by growing their own sugar and selling it back to Europe. And then you have people who make their way over here. And when the Spanish and eventually other Europeans make their way over here, they start to colonize, and in order to fill this economic niche. And they find that the labor was in such high demand. There was so much demand for labor in growing sugarcane. Sugarcane is a highly labor-intensive crop to grow, that they didn't have enough poor Europeans, indentured servants here. So what do they start to do? They start to import people from Africa. So this involuntary import of laborers to the Caribbean. But now, and go watch that video now, actually, go watch that video. The 5-minute video on the Atlantic slave trade that is on your Canvas. Okay, so you watched that video and you saw that while traditionally people had enslaved people all over the world, but the excuse they usually used was you're from a different nation or you're from a different religion. But now with colonization, because colonization was using religion as a way to homogenize cultures, you couldn't use that same excuse, because now you had people who were Christian who you were enslaving, and you couldn't use the same excuse of it's okay to enslave them because they're not Christian. So now you had to come up with this other idea. And this other idea was that we are physiologically different based on skin color. And that became a convenient way to enslave 350 million people throughout the course of institutionalized slavery in the Americas. So there you go. If we don't believe that race is or if you don't believe me when I say that race is a fake thing, first, why wasn't it discussed before the convenient justification of the use of race in the 1600s in African slavery in the Caribbean? Why is that the first time that people were suddenly like, oh, look, there's a thing called race, and that makes it okay for people to enslave other people? And one of the biggest dispellers of this myth of race is that you can have people who are mixed race, that if we were physiologically different, then we wouldn't be able to reproduce in the same way that you could reproduce with people of your own race. So the fact that we can reproduce and very quickly create people of blended race shows that there isn't really a physiological difference. That's one big identifier, is that we can procreate across races. If we were physiologically different, we wouldn't be able to do that without creating perhaps a third kind of human being, if that makes sense. So when we look at this creation of the word race, it has everything to do with slavery in the Americas and creating a justification for enslaving, like I said, 350 million people over the course of several hundred years here in the Americas. So, and here, by the way, is our map of the movement of people, the involuntary movement of people from Africa to the Americas. And you can see like where Brazil, for example, would have, a lot of their economy in the early days grew because of the trade of African slaves. That was one of the reasons that Brazil was the last country to outlaw slavery. You can see like the massive amount of laborers that were needed in the Caribbean, that were needed in South America, and were needed up here in North America. Now, when I say need, I don't mean to justify that involuntary enslavement of human beings. But it shows the flow of people, where people would have come from. A lot of people would have come from Angola, for example, today's Angola, and all through this western part of Africa. That's important to note because we tend to think of Africans as all genetically similar. Like that goes along with the idea of race, right? This idea that if you are Black, you are of African origin, and you must have the same kind of genetic basis. But Africa is this gigantic 20% of the world's landmass. All people come from Africa. That's where the human race started. The human race, by the way, is a real thing. It's just races within humans are not a real thing. And so the people who populate the Americas today, who are related to people who were involuntarily transported to the Americas. So people that we refer to here in the US as African American, right? African American is a culture. It's a culture that was created from the people who were involuntarily moved here and enslaved here. But not all Black people are African American, obviously, because Black people come from all over the world, for one, and all over Africa. But if you look, the people who are part of African American culture today in the US would be primarily from Western Africa and from Angola. That the physical traits or the phenological traits that might be associated with a Somalian person or an Ethiopian person are not necessarily going to be the same phenologic traits that we're going to see in people who are part of our African American culture here today. So some of the grounding, some of the ways that people have tried to justify the idea of race in the past has been through DNA, for one, that through our DNA we're different based on this idea of race. So DNA does not correlate to the physical traits associated with race, though. If we think about the physical traits that we associate with race, color of your skin, eye shape, eye color, hair color, hair texture, those are all kind of the main things that we associate with race. There's more things that people associate with race. And just to give you an idea of how internalized our idea of racism is that there are still medical products, medical companies today that create things like bone density scanners that have switches. This is true here in the US and in Japan, that have switches between like an Asiatic Caucasian person and an African person. So this idea that somehow bone density scanners need to be different based on race, when really they don't, because there is nothing about our bone density that correlates with the color of our skin. But that's how internalized racism is in our cultures, that we even manufacture medical goods based on this non-medical idea that we're different based on the color of our skin. So our DNA doesn't correlate to the physical traits that we associate with race, things like our outer physical skin, right? Phenotypes, those are physical traits. So difference in skin tone are gradual, they're not discrete, meaning that people who are part of one race are a whole variety of skin tones. And so if you think about me as a white woman, right? I'm a very pale white woman. I'm a redhead. I freckle. I don't tan. I just straight up burn if I go out in the sun, really for like 10 minutes, I would just get a sunburn. Whereas other people who would be classified as racially a white woman might tan, might have all kinds of different skin tone reactions because their skin tone is different. So if we look at people who are part of one race, the variation in skin tone, the variation in eye color, in eye shape, the variation in hair color and hair texture, and et cetera, all of that varies a whole lot between our concepts of race because differences in skin tone, in skin color, and hair texture are not discrete. And then blood type variations, they occur independently. So another thing that people might prove to, or might attempt, other things that people might use to attempt to prove a concept of physiological differences based on race would be things like blood type, but blood type variations have absolutely nothing to do with your skin color or your hair texture. Another way that people have attempted to prove ideas of race are transmission genetics. So genes that are transmitted from one generation to the next generation. But they lead to very specific physical traits that aren't generally associated with a racial group once again. So of course, your skin tone and your skin color and your hair color and your eye color and stuff like that are going to be related to your parents, but the types of genetic transmissions that we see from one generation to the next, they don't have so much to do with this like with this specific physical trait, with this general racial characteristic. It has more to do with specifically who your parents are and what physical traits they might have. And then genealogy, another term or another idea that's used to justify this concept of race, doesn't actually show, I should say show, not showg, race. Populations descend from a common ancestor, and we may have common genetic characteristics, but these, again, don't correlate necessarily with the visible traits that are associated with race. So you might ask, well, then why do people have different skin colors and different hair tones and stuff like that? I'll go back to this world map real fast. It has to do with how we have adapted to our geography. Once again, the answer is geography, and it has to do with outer adaptations to what your geography is. As people, so we all come from here. Actually, I have another world map there. So we all come from right in here. This is where humans started, and humans have spent 150,000 years here. And we started to leave. There's different time periods associated with when people moved from Africa to other parts of the world, but let's say 65,000 years ago, 95,000 years ago, something show. But when people eventually came all the way up here to Scandinavian Peninsula, for example, you get up there, there's no sun half the year. You, instead of sun protection, you need skin that allows in more vitamin D. So what you see are people who adapt with lighter skin in order to absorb more vitamin D. When you look at people who made their way over here to East Asia, you have a whole lot of wind, right? So one thing that I've read, and I've had people who laugh at me for saying this, but it's something that I've read, that the reason that some Asian people might have more skin over their eyes, it has to do with adaptation to wind and to like what would have been blowing in your eyes. For whatever reason, whatever the reason is, we physically adapted to our different physical geographies. But our ability to procreate, our actual insides haven't adapted in any way. And I mean, if you don't believe me, there's no greater evidence than that the closer you are to the equator, the darker your skin is, and the further away you are from the equator, the lighter your skin is. And that correlates with things like eye color as well. So back here, once we have this concept of race that was developed in the 1600s that was used to categorize people based on skin color and then justify treating different people differently, we also have the creation of this thing called the Great Chain of Being. So the Great Chain of Being, and this is a very bad picture of it, but you can't actually find very good pictures of it, was this idea that there is a chain of being in the world, and that chain of being correlated with things like godliness and intelligence. So up here at the top, you would have had God. Underneath God, you would have had angels, and even angels are ranked according to the Great Chain of Being, with archangels like Michael and Daniel and Gabriel being up here at the top, all the way down to like the little chubby cherubs would have been angels, so above humans, but lesser angels than Michael, for example. And then you get to humans, and of course, who's going to be at the top of this Great Chain of Being? We'll think about who created it. White men are going to be at the top. The Great Chain of Being, by the way, doesn't actually show any women on it. So, and then you would have seen this general work down the Great Chain of Being that would have made its way through different people and the color of people's skin, and then made its way to animals, and animals at the top would have been like the lions and the tigers, those kinds of animals, all the way down to the wee ferret, etc., etc. Even plants are part of this order, excuse me, of the Great Chain of Being, and the larger plants are the ones that are more important down to the smaller plants. So, so I just thought of something as I was explaining that Great Chain of Being, something that has to do with what I'm talking about. Well, hopefully I'll remember in a minute. Okay, so what was I going to say? So let's talk about apartheid, because we are familiar with concepts of race and racism, probably some of us more than others, whether we've lived race and racism, whether we have learned race and racism. It's a nature of racism that it presents itself to people based on racist structures more than other people. Does that make sense? So it's good to also take into account when learning about race, because we are so indoctrinated into our own culture, it's hard for us to kind of reach out of our cultural norms and see that like when I introduced ideas that, okay, maybe this whole concept of race is made up. Some people are like, no, but I know, because they have all kinds of cultural influences that they've grown up around that are maybe hard for you to, you know what I'm trying to say. When we live in a culture, it's sometimes hard to see that culture pretty clearly, which is one of the reasons that we like to study geography, because if we look at another culture that has taken in the concept of race and racism, it's easier maybe to see some of the falsities of racism. So I have this apartheid racism perfected. And the reason that I say that is because the people who created apartheid, the South Africans who created apartheid, literally went out and studied other parts of the world who were pretty racist societies. They went to Holland, they went to Australia, they went to the United States, and they studied systems of institutionalized racism, figured out what worked, figured out what didn't work, and brought it back into what eventually became the system of apartheid. So let me give you a little background on South Africa. Here's South Africa, this country all the way in the south of Africa. So South Africa has been populated with people for about 100,000 years. Remember, we come from right here. So just in the same way that we made our way into Asia, made our way to Australia, made our way to Europe, made our way to the Americas, we made our way to other parts of Africa. So about 100,000 years, we've had people who have lived here. Now, remember we talked about the colonization of Africa And remember, I showed you that map of the nations of people who would have existed in Africa before colonization, and how intentionally colonists came in and divided those united people to give the colonists an edge in taking over this gigantic piece of land, right? 20% of the world's land surface is Africa. So one method that was used was to divide and conquer, and they divided and conquered in many different ways. So South Africa is a little bit different because you have, like I said, people living there for about 100,000 years. You have many, many different nations of people who would have lived there, including the Zulu, the Hausa. I know that I don't do that very well, that there's people who would click that much faster. Hausa is a click language. For example, those are just two nations that existed in South Africa and still exist in South Africa, that existed before colonization. So South Africa has this tip right here. The horn is, no, not the horn, sorry. The Cape right here was a Dutch settlement. So starting in 1652, that's when the Dutch set up Cape Town, this settlement right on the Cape. And you can imagine why they would have set it up. That essentially in the 1600s, you had people who were making their way into East Asia through Southwest Asia, who were making their way into different parts of Africa, but who were also, so they were going overland on what we call the Silk Road, but they were also going by boat along what was called the Spice Route. And as boats got faster and more reliable, then people used the Spice Route a little bit more because it was easier than going overland, and it was much shorter than going overland, or faster, I should say, not shorter. So the Dutch set up a small colony just right here on the tip, and it was a trading colony. And that trading colony was based on the traffic that would have been coming from Europe on their way into East Asia. And that trade would have accounted for both trade of African goods, South African goods, Zulu, Hausa goods, other people's goods, as well as trade that would have been familiar to Europeans, if that makes sense. So you have 1652, you have the beginning of that. Now that's not the colonization that we talked about in Africa. That is pre that period of colonization, right? That period of colonization that cuts up Africa into the countries that we see today starts in 1884, if you remember. So 1652 is very early. So what happens eventually when Africa becomes this site for colonization from Europeans, so when Europeans essentially are getting kicked out of the Americas and they make their way over to Africa and start to colonize in all the ways that we talked about earlier in the semester, well, you have English people who are particularly interested in South Africa. So the Dutch colonizers of the 1652 era moved in, like inside South Africa, and they become what's called the Afrikaners. So Afrikaners, I would have written that down on the board if we were in class. Let me write that down so you know what that word is. Let's see, Afrikaners. I need to make sure that I'm writing it correctly. There we go. Didn't do anything. Sorry about this. There we go. So that word Afrikaners right in there. That becomes what's called the white tribe of Africa. So the white tribe of Africa being the former Dutch colonizers who were pushed in to South Africa, further into South Africa when the English come in and start to take over. So the English come over, and you have the Afrikaners are also called the Boers, if you've ever had that term before, B-O-E-R, B-O-E-R, is that right? Yeah, and that is Afrikaans for farmer. So Boer is a term, you might have heard of the Boer Wars of the late 1700s and then into the late 1800s, but Boer means farmer, and Afrikaner refers to what's called the White Tribe of Africa, those Dutch people who were colonists who were kind of pushed into South Africa when the English come in and attempt to colonize. So 1899 is when the official British colony of South Africa, and it was called the United British Colony of South Africa. Is that what it was called? Or it was called the United Colony of South Africa. It's either United Colony of South Africa or United British Colony of South Africa. And they used the same tactics that people used all over Africa to divide up Africa, like we talked about. They used different groups of people against each other. They used existing aristocracies to do kind of the dirty work of colonization. They split up unified regions and put people, like pieces of different unified regions, into new countries. You had all that happen with the English here in South Africa. And they set up what were called, or they set up missionary schools. So a big part that, again, we talked about with African colonization was the introduction of Christianity and the homogenizing force of Christianity. And so you would have had these missionary schools that were set up all over South Africa to educate people. And they would have educated people with British and European history, with Western science, Western ideas of medicine. That's all part of cultural genocide. If you remember, cultural genocide is keep the people as laborers, but remove them from their culture, remove them from their cultural identity. If I remove you from your cultural identity, then your sense of self-worth, your sense of ownership, entitlement to this land, all of that can be kind of diminished when you have this introduction, when you have this cultural genocide. So the other thing that those missionary schools did, and this is true in Australia, this is true in different parts of Africa, in different parts of the Americas, is they created this cultural standard of whiteness, right? They created this cultural idea of, for example, in South Africa, it would have been Britishness, that you can overcome your inferior culture if you go to our Christian schools, if you learn the ways of the European, if you learn the ways of the proper religion, the proper way of commerce, the proper way of civilization, you can actually transcend your kind of low status in life based on your ethnicity, based on your your location of your physical geography. So that's an important thing to note, because those missionary schools allowed, so again, they were very much steeped in European ideologies. They weren't teaching the history of African peoples or anything like that, but they kind of allowed for a more broad view of education than what happens under apartheid. So, and that's important to keep in mind, because Nelson Mandela was a product of those missionary schools, as opposed to what comes after, what are called the Bantu schools. Bantu is Bantu. So what happens is you have this British colony that begins in 1899, and then 1948 is apartheid. So South Africa becomes independent. It's no longer a colony of the British. And just like so many of these other countries that start to become independent, South Africa was an earlier country to become independent, but so many of these other countries, if you remember, the DR Congo becomes independent from the Belgians in 1961, that now you have kind of this scramble for power. And because South Africa became independent before the Cold War really gets going, it's interesting, because while many of these places become a battleground for who's going to control the resources, the first world or the second world, South Africa, you have the precedence of these Afrikaners, right? This white tribe of Africa that exists in Africa for several hundred years before this introduction of colonization. So what happens is you have this country become independent, and you have Afrikaners, this group of people who had been in South Africa for many generations, who were white, attempt to take control of a country. And they figured, how are we going to take control of this country? Because even though we've been here for a while, we are the minority here. There's not a large population of Afrikaners here. So how are we going to take control of this country? Well, we need to use the same tactics that are used in colonization. We need to divide and conquer. And that's when the people who frame apartheid like I said, go to Holland, go to the US, go to Australia, and study institutionalized racism. And what they come back with is this system of racism that, in many ways, addressed any issues that people would have had in other places. And by issues, I mean issues of people attempting to break apart that system of racism. So, what they do is they first of all create 4 different races. So this is one other way to like kind of quickly dispel the idea of race. One is, how many races are there? You know, are there 3 races? Are there 4 races in the world? No. If you look at the 7.7 billion people in the world, they do not fit into 4 different categories. So apartheid comes up with this system that includes 4 races. Those races are white, black, colored. That was a real race, colored. It is still considered a real race. Sorry, is still a term that is used frequently. And then Indian. So those are our 4 different races in under apartheid South Africa. So black, white, colored, Indian. All right. Now, a whole lot of rules were placed on these 4 different groups of people, and you might question why these are the 4 races. So black and white, well, that makes sense when we're talking about the white tribe of Africa, and we're talking about South Africans, Zulu and Hausa people. And then colored is the term used for people who are both of black and white. Sorry. People who are mixed, black and white. Sorry. People who we would call mixed race here. So, and then Indian, because you had a whole lot of Indian people from South Asia. So one tactic that the English used, that the British used when they were colonizing, is they colonized a lot of the world. If there's this phrase called, or phrase that goes, the sun never sets on the English Empire, or the sun never sets on the British Empire. And that refers to how the British had colonized so many different parts of the world that it was daytime basically in one part of the British Empire. And one of the ways that they took over places like South Asia, because South Asia, the British Raj, refers to what's today Pakistan, India, Burma, Myanmar, and Nepal. All of those countries were one colony. So how are you going to control people in that one colony? Well, you're going to use a lot of the same tactics that you would have used in other places to divide and conquer. But you could also incentivize people from here to move to other parts of your empire. So when we go to Uganda, for example, there is a good number of people who are South Asian. When you go to Guyana, this little country right here that was colonized by the British, you also, oh, my voice, sorry. Okay, sorry about that. So when you go to Guyana, which was a British colony, Guyana is mostly people of South Asian origin. When you go to Mauritius, this little country right here, once again, mostly South Asian. So, and then South Africa had a lot of South Asian people as well. It was a way to first take the, like, kind of strip the numbers from South Asia. If you're trying to colonize the 3rd oldest civilization in the world that is already well populated, well, one thing you could do is kind of thin out the numbers. Plus, added benefit would be that now you're creating more kind of groups of people that you can use to isolate and you can use against your other parts of the world that you're colonizing, if that makes sense. So if we want to divide people here in South Africa, well, like we saw in African colonization, you divided people based on national origin, you divided people based on socioeconomic class, stuff like that. But it's even better if you can introduce a whole different group of people, and now those people are isolated, and it just allows for more division in your culture. Does that make sense? So there were a lot of South Asians in South Africa, so many so that you had to have that 4th race in order to create this distinct idea that the four most populous people in South Africa were all distinctly racially different people. So now you have to register as one of those races. It's not just what you identify as, you have to register. And your race determined where you could live, where you could work. For example, if you were a Black man, you worked in industry, manufacturing, you worked in a factory, or you worked in farming, or you worked in the mines, right? Diamond mines, gold mines, limestone, all kinds of mines in South Africa. If you were a Black woman, then you could work again as a manufacturer, as a factory worker. You could work as a maid. You could work as a domestic worker, something like that. So now you have to classify yourself as one of these four races. And once you're one of these four races, it's going to determine what kind of work you can do, where you can go to school, where you can live. They had people isolated based on race as well as based on national origin before South Africa. So for example, if you're Zulu, you were Black as well as you lived in a part of South Africa that would have only Zulu people could have lived there. And these different parts of South Africa or these different neighborhoods had to be separated by open land. So you could have a group of Indian people living here, you could have a group of Black people living here, colored people living here, and there were pieces of land literally separating those different places. Like Soweto, for example, is a very, very large neighborhood of Black people, Black residents who would have lived in outside of the main city of Johannesburg or Cape Town or one of the main cities. You would have had this was a place that was identified for Black people to live. And your education would be in that place as well. And not only did they teach you based on race, they taught you based on language. So if you were Zulu, they taught you in Zulu. If you were Xhosa, they taught you in Xhosa. And that was a way of, once again, remember, this is a minority of people trying to take over a country. And if you just identify people as Black and the majority of the country is Black, well, pretty soon that majority of the country is going to be like, what the hell are we doing, right? So let's divide those people even further. Let's focus on divisions within those people based on nations. Zulu people were warriors, right? Xhosa people were thinkers. Mandela was a Xhosa person who who would have, like, under the South African apartheid, there would have been a lot of focus on the traits associated with being Xhosa, like you were intellectual, like you were a thinker, as opposed to Zulu, you were a warrior. So teaching people in different languages was a way to divide people, because if we can see each other as different racially, but then we're the same race, how are we going to divide further? Well, let's create linguistic differences. Let's create cultural differences, perceived cultural differences. So you have the introduction of the Bantu schools. So you're going to school, just like under the English colony, you would have gone to school to Christian missionary schools. Now you're going to Bantu schools. Now, Bantu schools took away all of that European history. And again, it's not good to learn only European history, of course, but essentially, if you were Black in South African apartheid, you went to the Bantu school and you basically learned how to count and how to read, and that was it. So there was no idea that you were ever going to be anything more than a farmer, a person who could count the amount of food that was, like the crops that you were growing. It was, like I said, under that system of colonization, while in no way am I condoning this, like it was a good thing that the British set up these Christian missionary schools that allowed you to idealize European history. It still gave you more of a background, more of an educational background than Bantu schools, which essentially said, this is all you're good for. All you're good for is counting, so go farm. And count how many, whatever it is you're bringing to market. So what else? What else about apartheid? So apartheid set up all these different rules, and if you were to put all these rules together, it'd be about 3,000 pages. So 3,000 pages of ways to divide people based on race. And another specific rule was you couldn't marry, live with, cohabitate with, have sex with somebody outside of your race. And those were rules that existed in Australia, that existed here in the US, but not so much the sex rule. So rules like you couldn't get married. It wasn't until Loving versus Virginia in 1968, 1967, here in the US, that it became overturned, that there were all these different laws in different states that said that you couldn't marry people of different races. So that was challenged in the Supreme Court in 1967, 1968, Loving versus Virginia. Australia had the same types of laws, same types of rules. You had, rules here in the US that kept people going to different schools, all the same things that I'm describing that happened in South Africa. Remember, apartheid studied the structure of racism in the US. So a lot of the things that you're seeing in South Africa might look familiar because they were studied here. They were based on ideas here. Separating people based on school, separating people based on hospitals. That was a rule here in the US and in Australia. For a long time in Australia, if you were Black, you couldn't go to the hospital at all. And when there were Black hospitals that were run by missionaries, again, the number of them was not plentiful. So the likelihood that you were Aboriginal and close to a Black hospital was pretty low, but they wouldn't even treat you at the hospital. So that was something that apartheid saw in Australia and the US and copied in South Africa. By the way, one thing that happened here in the US, so as you know, we used to have here in the US separate schools based on race. We had this whole separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1898, that said that as long as they were equal, they could be separate. And then you have the bringing down of that in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 that starts to see the integration of schools. And you probably know the history here that the integration of schools was not met with a whole lot of like open arms. That Ruby Bridges is our first African-American girl person. It wasn't just that she was a girl here in the US who integrated a school when she was a kindergartner. She was 5 years old. And then you have the Little Rock Nine who integrate colleges in Alabama. Little Rock, Canada. Little Rock, that's Arkansas. Sorry. What am I talking about? Just ignore what I just said. The Little Rock Nine, those are the 9 people who went into university. Anyway, the point that I'm trying to make is when we eventually have integration of schools here in the US, we have the hospitals, the schools that would have served only Black people here are closed. What happens to the teachers, the administrators, the people who would have worked in those Black only schools? What we have is this like deficit in education where a lot of people who would have been Black, who would have worked as Black educators, are now out of work. And we actually see this real drop in the number of teachers who are of a diverse range of ethnicities. We're starting to see that catch up, but it leads to, in the 70s and the 80s, this real drop in teachers who are of different ethnic backgrounds. And so while we achieve this integration on the student side, we don't have very integrated looking schools on the instructor, teacher, administrator side. So that's something that I like to point out. Okay, so why would you outlaw sex between races in South Africa? The reason is it can lead to a baby, and a baby, like I said, is the fastest way to disprove this idea that we're different based on race. So we have in South Africa this third race of people who are colored, and colored people are of mixed race, right? But because it was illegal to have a colored child in South Africa, what they did is they would remove children who were, like let's say that you have a Black mother who gives birth to a child who is of mixed race. The system of apartheid would have taken that baby from her and given that baby to a colored couple. So you basically, like, you have to make it look all visually the same. So you had this removal of children of mixed race who were then sent to households where you would have had a colored couple. If that makes sense. Another thing is there was people in South Africa who didn't fit directly into the Indian, white, African colored races. So where were those people going to register? Because remember, you had to register. You had to register because it told you what kind of work you could do. If you could be in a park, if you could go to a certain school, et cetera, et cetera. So you had a good number of Chinese people in South Africa, and Chinese people were made to register as Black. So Chinese people were Black, Japanese people registered as white. So you had Chinese people and Japanese people who, once again, there's obvious differences between Chinese people and Japanese people. But again, it kind of shows a very arbitrary idea that Japanese people are considered white in South Africa and Chinese people are considered Black in South Africa. And the reason for that distinction was that South Africa wanted to do business with Japan. They wanted the Toyotas, they wanted the cameras, they wanted the high-end manufacturing that was happening there. And China had just fallen to communism, was now this communist economy. South Africa was interested in doing business with the West, not with the Second World. So they weren't necessarily encouraging of, or they didn't give any sort of preferential treatment to Chinese laborers who moved here, but they did to Japanese laborers because they wanted to do business with Japan. So when we look at the system of apartheid and this kind of perfected racism, it's a great way, again, to look at a different country, see that the way that country kind of set up these arbitrary ideas of race, and in dispelling this myth of race and dispelling this idea that race is this physiological difference between us instead of just a phenomenological difference based on adaptation to different environments, geographies. Okay, so before I start talking about this, I want you to go and watch the videos the TED Talks that I've set up on Canvas. One by Mellody Hobson. Mellody Hobson talks about the reason that we need to talk about race. I've had lots of students in the past who say things like, well, if race and racism if we just stopped talking about them, they would go away. But racism doesn't go away if you stop talking about it. It might for some people, like it might for me, because I'm not going to be nearly as affected by racism as another person. But she talks about the need to talk about race and be race brave. So watch that. And then also watch Mina Fomba. She talks about hair and kind of the objectification of Black bodies in different parts of the world. She's British. But that's a whole other interesting field of study, and it's a whole other part of our racist society that leads to like the literal objectification of people based on differences associated with different ethnicities and different races. So go watch her. And then I want you to watch Chika Okoro, who talks about colorism. And so colorism, if you're not aware, is that you have people who are in different racial groups of different, like I said, there's a whole range of people of skin color, of skin shade, of eye color, of hair texture within one race. And because we live in a society that favors whiteness, you have people who are lighter skinned favored in things like, so if you have a person who is Black but is lighter skinned, they might be favored in all the things that we see as a result of our racist society, like that Black people don't get hired as easily to jobs. So there's been a lot of different studies on, you have, a resume, the exact same resume, but you have a person with a white name and a person with a Black name, and that person with the Black name stays unemployed for about 5 weeks longer than the person with the white name. So exact same resume sent to a company, the person with the Black name tends to be rejected. We have other evidence in our society of that with things like how the pay gap, there's a gender pay gap, there's also a racial pay gap, and how people are paid less depending on ethnicity, on race. So colorism looks at within a race how there's objectification of people and there's preferential treatment of people based on the lightness or the darkness of their skin. So go watch that as well. And then come back. And now we're going to talk about the mono minority. So we have we've been focusing on Black and white, but of course there's many other types of racism. And we have this long history of different East Asian and South Asian people who have migrated into the US. And those different pockets of people have come into the US at different periods of time. So let me go back up here. If we look at the beginning of, let's say, Chinese immigration really gets going into California during the gold rush. The Chinese laborers would have been poor, uneducated people. They came into California. They were met with all kinds of racist laws, things like the Alien Land Law that didn't allow you to buy land in the US unless you were an American citizen. And if you were Chinese, you could not become an American citizen. Things like the Q ordinance in San Francisco that said that if you had a Q, that's the ponytail that people from the Qing dynasty would have worn, you had to cut it off. There was the Chinese Exclusion Act and later the Asian Exclusion Act that only allowed, so Chinese Exclusion Act 1882, Asian Exclusion Act 1907, that only allowed you as a Chinese person and then later as an East Asian person to come in for 3 months to do certain work and then go back. It only allowed men to come in as well. So there was almost no women. They did that for a couple of reasons. One was there was labor that people here in California wouldn't do, things like building the railroads, things like Sacramento, for example. Sacramento is a floodplain. And in order to make that floodplain a place that became like eventually this agricultural wonderland, you had to fill in a lot of the marsh. Well, animals won't get into that marsh because they don't like the way that it feels on their hooves, right? Like you couldn't use horses. But they used Chinese laborers basically to go in and stamp down the marshes all through the Sacramento Valley. And it turned Sacramento from a place where land was worth $1 per acre to $100 per acre. So it just shot up the land value of Sacramento, but Chinese people couldn't partake in any of that, even though their labor was used to bring up the value of land. The Alien Land Law said that they couldn't buy any of that land, so they were relegated as like literal hard laborers with very, very little benefit. And after 3 months, they had to go back to China. They didn't want women coming to the US because if you have women, Chinese women in the US and Chinese men in the US, they could have a baby, and then that baby has access to citizenship. So it was a way of using the laborer, but not keeping the people. Okay, so and I could repeat that story with Koreans, with Japanese people, with Filipino people. There are different waves of people who come in with Southeast Asian people. There's different waves of, and when we say Asian, we're referring to East Asian, right? I don't know why I just put up quotes. When we say Asian, we're referring to East Asian. So for a long time, we had these very negative stereotypes of East Asian people, stereotypes that Chinese people were ungodly, Japanese people were ungodly, they just didn't have the same Judeo-Christian faith as Europeans, so you just can't trust them, et cetera, et cetera. But then we start to see those Asian stereotypes change, and we start to see them really change in the 1960s, 1970s, where you have this collection of positive Asian stereotypes, this idea that they are the perfect minority, strong work ethic, meek politically, meek socially, right? They don't talk a whole lot. Strict parents, the Asian tiger parent, good at math, good at finances, good at owning businesses. All of those become these positive stereotypes around East Asian people, really starting in the 1960s and starting in the 1970s. And one of the reasons that switches is because, once again, it's the whole divide and conquer mentality that we see played out over and over again. So if we, as the US, continue to oppress people based on ethnicity, based on country of origin, based on color of skin, one way of creating, and this is kind of a similar thing that I just talked about with apartheid, but before apartheid, sorry, with South Africa under the British, where if you create a model of a person that you, as this lesser culture, can aspire to, well, that gives you some idea that, like, no, we're not racist, because look, we have people of different ethnicities and races. We have Asian people, and they're such hard workers, and they're so good at math, and we treat them perfectly well. If you would just work harder and own your businesses better and do better at school, you could be like those Asians, right? It was a way of dividing people based on race and creating this. It's the same thing that you would have seen in African colonization with the existing aristocracies being promoted by colonial powers, and then other groups of people in that same new country who would have been used for their labor. So when we see these positive Asian stereotypes, they also correlate with changes in immigration policies. So you have these immigration policies starting in 1964, really, that start to give visas to East Asian people who are college educated. So if you were Japanese, for example, and you wanted to come to the US, the only Japanese people who were being given visas were people who were middle class, college educated. So that would have been a very different group of migrants coming in than, let's say, well, Southeast Asians, which I'll talk about in just a minute. But let's say people coming from countries where you have an eco-famine or where you have a destroyed economy. So you might have had people coming in from different Latin American countries who were migrating here because of turmoil at home, who weren't necessarily college educated, middle class. And it would have created a very different group of migrants, because let's say that you come into the US from Japan, you're already a doctor. And as you probably know, if you come from college educated parents, or if you don't come from college educated parents, like I don't, my parents didn't even finish the 9th grade. So the pressure to go to school is very different based on where you, on like what your family kind of expectations are. You know, if you have a family of laborers, your family might want you to go the next step above their social class or their economic class. But if you have a family of doctors, the expectation is that you're going to be a doctor or a surgeon or an engineer. Does that make sense? So when we have this difference in people who come here based on difference in favoring visas, you are creating a very different group of people based on a history of college education, a history of middle class. So it was an easy way for people in the US to kind of divide and conquer people based on different races, different ethnicities. And the problem with this too is there's many problems with it. One is that Southeast Asians who came in at the same time period and who continue to migrate here, migrated because of war. So while Japanese people and Chinese people were favored with visas if they were college educated and middle class, Southeast Asians were coming as a result of, a lot of people at the same time period were coming as a result of they were refugees, so they had refugee status. So Vietnamese people, for example, Cambodian people, they fled the Vietnam War and the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And so those people get kind of linked into this positive group of Asian stereotypes, and they end up being ignored in their needs. So if you look at our education disparity, for example, 6% of Chinese Americans, so only 6% of Chinese Americans have just a high school diploma, meaning that the majority of Chinese Americans go to college and finish college, whereas about half Cambodian Americans just go to high school. And so if we look at the disparity of these numbers, because we link East Asians together and Southeast Asians together as like just being Asian, and so coming from a background where you're going to be good at math and your parents are going to be strict and they're going to be focused on school and all of these positive stereotypes that we associated with Asians. The problem is that you have these pockets of people who are Asian American who are ignored in their needs for things like access to education, access to tutors, access to scholarships, access to food insecurity needs, all the kind of stuff that because we group people in together, we ignore the needs of specific parts of this community. If we look at the poverty rate, for example, it varies a whole lot depending on where you're from in East or South Asia. And then another thing that always really astounds me is the rate of abuse endured by Asian American women. So white women, the rate of domestic abuse that happens with white women is about 21%. So about 21% of white women in the US have experienced or will experience spousal domestic abuse. 35% of African American Black women will, again, experience or have experienced domestic abuse. But we're looking at 40 to 60% of Asian American women who experience domestic violence. And again, the reason that I bring up this number is because of positive stereotypes that are associated with the Asian American community. You have large groups of people whose issues are ignored because of all the things that I've explained. So now go watch the TED Talk that I posted on the myth of the model minority. Okay. And then one more example of dividing and conquering Hawaiian plantations. So Hawaiian plantations the monarchy is overthrown. American businesses come in. They want to grow things like pineapples, coffee, sugar, and you have all these very racist policies that are put in place, like that people who aren't white can't own land, and that's including Hawaiians. Can't vote, can't be part of the political system, but you need all these laborers because once again, like in the Caribbean, growing sugar is very, very labor intensive. So the way Hawaiian plantations did, or Hawaiian plantation owners did it, is they utilized a lot of the people who were poor and leaving their countries of origin. So Korean people, Chinese people, Japanese people, Filipino people, Portuguese people, and Hawaiians all would have been working on these plantations. Now, Hawaiian plantation owners would pay people a little bit differently depending on their ethnicity. So if you were Japanese, you would make a little bit, and we're talking about like a few cents difference. So very, very little difference. But if you were Hawaiian, you would make a different wage than a Portuguese person, than a Japanese person, than a Filipino person. Why did they do that? They did it as a way to keep people fighting amongst themselves. Because if we're constantly fighting and we're looking at the Filipino group of people and we're like, they make this much and we make this much, then we're not looking at the real issue, which is that this Hawaiian plantation owner is reaping the benefit of our labor and paying us very, very little while they're profiting a lot. So let's switch gears to ethnicity. And once again, I've posted a couple of different things on ethnicity. One is called What is Ethnicity? So, and go watch that right after I talk about this. So while we've been talking a whole lot about race and the concept of race not being real, but racism being a very real result of it, let's look at ethnicity. So ethnicity is much more fluid than race. Ethnicity has to do with a lot of different things. So ethnicity, in order to be part of an ethnicity, you don't have to be all of these things. Sometimes I'll have students who are like, you have to have kind of like all of these different parts of being an ethnic group, like similar history, religion, ancestry, language. Well, these are just some of the things. So ethnicity is much more fluid, and the idea that it has to do with commonalities between people. And that can be, like I said, a whole range of people. Ethnicity really has very little to do with color of your skin, eye color. It has to do with a collection of people who maybe have a shared identified history, who maybe have a shared identified religion, who have an ancestry that might be the same or similar, who speak the same language. All of those kinds of identities that go along with ethnicity, it has more to do, very, very little to do with what you actually look like, and more to do with tradition and culture. So for example, I like to use my daughter as an example, who is Mexican and Chinese, and she's also part of me, right? So she has all of these different ethnicities kind of like swirling around in her. But what she looks like is she has blonde hair and blue eyes, and she tans like crazy, which is amazing because, like I said, I just burn as soon as I get in the sun. But if you were to look at her, you would think that she probably is a white person, and you would ignore that her ethnicity, her cultural characteristics include her Mexican grandparents, includes her. She has like a tiny bit of a lot of California Mexicans have Chinese people in their ancestry because, like I said, there was laws that said that you couldn't marry people of different races in the US, and California had this law that white people couldn't marry, and there was a whole list of people, but it wasn't really clear if those different groups of people could marry each other. So some judges would allow like Chinese people and Mexican people to get married and some wouldn't. But because you had mostly Chinese men who were here, some of the Chinese men who were able to stay here, there was really no Chinese women. So you had a lot of Chinese men marry Mexican women, marry women of different cultural backgrounds, which is why a lot of California Mexican families have like some Chinese influence as well. So when we look at, let's say, that one individual and her ethnic background and her cultural background, it's very diverse and very little of it is reflected in what she actually looks like. So that ethnic identity, like I said, can be very fluid. It's a collection of people with history, religion, ancestry, maybe a little bit of language. Now, these two terms, othering has to do with both belonging to and separating from a group. So one good thing about ethnicity, as well as a criticism of ethnicity, is the concept of othering. And that if I'm part of an ethnic group, well, that gives me cultural identity. And we've talked in this class so much about how cultural identity is very important when it has to do with ideas of yourself, self-importance, et cetera, but it can also create this separating quality. And so as I've said many times, one way to conquer people is to separate them. So with ethnicity, we both have this sense of belonging as well as this furthered othering. That's one criticism of, not my criticism, but a criticism of ethnic identity. And then this term ascription, and that term ascription has to do with assigning people an identity based on their ethnicity. And there's all kinds of things that we could do, but it's basically stereotypes. It's stereotypes that we might place on Asian women, stereotypes that we might place on Black men, stereotypes that we might place on et cetera, right? We could go through the whole list of ethnicities and races and talk about stereotypes associated with those people. Another term for that is ascription. It's looking at a person and deciding like, oh, they're going to be like this, or they're going to act like this, or they're going to react like this, or et cetera, et cetera. So there we go. So go watch that TED Talk on ethnicity. And before I go, it's really bugging me that I said the Little Rock Nine and then didn't know what I was talking about. So let me look it up. Hmm. 1954, segregated schools are illegal. Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education. Oh, that's what it was. Okay, so I was confusing two different things. All right, so the Little Rock Nine, that's Arkansas. That's where you have these 9 students who are the students who integrate Central High School. And then I was confusing that with what happened at the University of Alabama and the introduction. And that's when that's when the governor stood in the doorway and the National Guard had to be called out because you had these students who had been accepted to the University of Alabama and were the first Black students to go there. And you had the governor actually stand in the doorway. I was confusing those two stories in my head. Sorry about that. All right. I know you were very worried. All right. Enjoy the other videos that I posted. And next time we talk, it'll be about sexuality. Yay.